In our previous talks on linguistic anthropology so far, in all of our sessions, we've spoken about the fundamentals of semiotics. We've spoken about some of the pioneers, including, or more specifically, Saussure and Peirce. And we've looked at the, so far we've looked at the applications in various fields, including by Roland Barthes, which was the application of semiotics in the literary sense and literary fields and texts. We looked at psychology and the psychologist Jacques Lacan, and we continue that today, and we move on to somebody who has done, again, big things for semiotics, because everybody we're looking at is really quite prominent in the field for now. Later on we'll look at others who are not so prominent but who have still done some important work. Today we will look at Charles Morris. Okay, who was Charles Morris? Well, Charles Morris was an American philosopher, semiotician, and ultimately the person who developed the important work on pragmatics, the pioneer of pragmatics, so to speak, because like the post-structuralist idea of the sign not beginning where we say it begins, Charles Morris was really not the pioneer of pragmatics, because the idea of pragmatics was sort of long before there. But then Charles Morris came along and made it, the thing, And of course he had his precedents, including Charles Sanders Peirce and Mead and others, and building on their work, he developed what he did. Okay, so let us begin to speak about Charles Morris. So generally his work was a global approach to human science. It was a global approach to human science. And what did this mean? It was a motivation for him to develop certain fields in semiotics, and this included rational and goal-seeking semiotics, the science of the irrational, mysticism. He worked on man-cosmos, the interrelation of man and cosmos and the symbols there, malfunctioning signs, pathological signs, signs of mental illness, signs of social alienation, and so forth. And this was, I guess, the very, very general aspect of his work. And we will, as I said a long time ago, we will begin at the periphery and we'll slowly make our way to the center, if not in this session, in subsequent sessions. Okay, all right. So generally, Charles Morris was a second-generation pragmatist. Second generation, meaning that, pragmaticism and pragmatism was there prior to Morris. It was there. He didn't wake up one morning and say, oh, I have this idea that nobody else has thought of, because other people had begun to get it, and then he took other people's ideas and he developed that. And he basically recovered and relaunched the philosophical trend in an era of neopositivism, which was dominating the United States at the time, neopositivism. And he then made breakthroughs with pragmatism and other fields such as semantics and syntax and everything. Okay, so his two very important groups of works, I guess three works. One was the book Logical Positivism, Pragmatism and Scientific Empiricism in 1937, right? And two essays, Scientific Empiricism and Peirce, Mead and Pragmatism, were very important because in those three works, his ideas of pragmatism really first strongly appeared. and they were the springboards or the open doors for his ideas on pragmatism. And then he had another work in 1938, which was the Foundations of Theory of the Signs, Foundations of the Theory of Signs, in 1938. And in this work, he indicated that he was definitely somebody to be considered as quite serious about working on signs and so forth. Morris told us that his work was basically derived from a few people, and he was quite clear about the fact that initially, his work did not emanate from or stem from the work of Charles Sanders Peirce. He told us that his work was built on his superior at the time, who was George Mead, and two others, Edward Tolman and Clark Hull. And later on, he tells us how he also, and in sequential stages of his life, he also built on the work of other people, and we'll get to that in a little. But in his works, Signs About Signs, About Signs, About Signs, About Signs, About Signs, which was the title of a book, so I think it was 3 times, Signs About Signs, About Signs in 1948, and in Signs, Language and Behavior in 1946, he tells us that his work on signs and behavioristics was not something that he took from Charles Sanders Peirce, but it was something that he took from Herbert Mead. In fact, I quote, to quote Charles Morris, he tells us that my own work in signs, language and behavior, supplemented by the later study signification and significance, might be regarded as a way to organize and to extend the contributions to semiotic by the various pragmatist philosophers. It was not done, however, with any such goal explicitly in mind. My own work started from Mead and not from Peirce. The influence of Dewey, Lewis, Peirce, and Rudolf Carnap came later and in that order. So he's clearly telling us that his work was from Mead, and then he gives us the sequence of people and chronological sequence of people from whose work he built his own. But subsequently his work was quite influential for the field of linguistics and the field of semiotics and everything. Very, very influential. Charles Morris has been a very important person, and obviously, and as he later says, his work has built on the pragmatism, or as Peirce says, pragmatism, by Peirce, by Charles Sanders Peirce. Let us now ground his work, and let's see what his work was grounded on. He did build from Peirce, and the first thing there is that we can say there is that he was in agreement with Peirce, and definitely about Peirce's action of sign, and the sign having a very strong element of action. And he suggested that Peirce's semiosis and the action of sign was something that needed work, and half of it, part of it, was true, but then there was significant aspect of it that was not true, and that included the goal orientation aspect of Peirce. And Peirce did speak about goal orientation, but not to the extent that Morris did subsequently, and Morris did include then the important aspect of goal orientation, and this implies that the sign process includes a subject, an organism, goal-oriented behavior, and of course a final goal, which is an object that is somehow outside of semiosis. So Morris tells us then that building on from Peirce, that the action of the sign must first induce a response or interpretation that identifies the sign, and then the sign can progress. And subsequent to this, the sign then responds through some sort of goal-seeking behavior, and this then constitutes a whole sequence or series or group of steps that sequentially follow one another and then produce a sign which is a group of signs, and each of which is a group of signs, and this becomes sort of a sigma function, right? A sigma function, or a series, an infinite series possibly, finite or infinite series, but we speak about that later in the anthropological part of the talk. So Peirce told us then, going back to Peirce told us that the object is dynamical, that is, there's a ground, and then from the ground we see a gradual manifestation to the object. Okay, so there's a ground and there's a gradual manifestation. And this is quite structuralist, you know, that in the sense that there's a start and then there's a product. And when we look at post-structuralism, we'll see that this is not the case. You know, the ground ceases to be a ground and more of a intermediate notion or step or something. However, Peirce at no point told us that the behavior of the sign or behavior of the person or producer of the sign, and that's a very dangerous word, the producer of the sign, there's nothing in the producer of the sign or in the sign suggests that there is a goal or, you know, the tendency to move towards a goal. So Charles Morris then decided that rather than there being a goal, and when I use the word goal, you know, it's also a dangerous term to use because what does goal mean? When you speak about the interpretant or the semiotic object or something, then, you know, that is a goal, but, you know, okay. So then Charles Morris told us that, look, there is no goal, but there are goals, many, many goals, and hence the infinite breaking up of the sign, away from the idea of a goal to the idea of many goals. Okay, so in looking at Peircean work, Morris found two very interesting things that he spoke about. The first one was that it's not necessary for a theory to belong to psychological or philosophical behavior and philosophical behavioral trends and psychological behavioral trends to achieve important results in semiotics. And the second thing that Morris found, quite significant in Peircean work, is that semiotics must not be grounded. It must not be grounded in the mentalistic order of things, so to achieve status of science, but must be grounded in behavioristics, such as a general theory of behavior and including sign behavior. So these two things were quite significant that Morris found in Peirce's work. And in building on Peirce's work, and in his text, Signs, Language and Behavior of 1946, he found Peirce's mediation and thirdness, the idea of thirdness, quite interesting. And in this idea, Peirce connected the processes of the sign and mental processes through some sort of sin identification, identifying with each other. The mental processes and the sign processes were somehow connected, said Peirce. And then, so there was a discrepancy between what Peirce was saying, that there is a triadic approach. And if you recall the diagram, which we will see again very soon, there was a triadic approach. There was the grounding, there was the object, there was the semiotic object, and there was the interpretant. And there was a discrepancy between this and the two-term binary relation between stimuli and response that was very popular in behaviorism at the time. And this was a discrepancy, said Morris, unless the stimulus-response relation was mediated by a third factor, which was to act as a kind of reinforcing function of sorts. And this was the springboard for Morris building his work. Again, going back to Peirce. Peirce told us back in the very, very beginning of the 20th century, when Peirce was at his peak, he defined the sign, and he told us that a sign is a representamen of which some interpretant is a cognition of mind. And if you remember, the interpretant is the C at the top. When we look back at our diagram, we'll recall that the interpretant is not the A, not the B, but the C. And that is the very situated interpretation of Peircean work. And Peirce told us that a sign is a representamen of which some interpretant is a cognition of a mind. However, Peirce did not provide a criterion for the mind or for thought intervention. And remember, thought intervention is the condition for determining the existence of the sign. So Peirce did not provide criterion for this, and Morris had issue with this. So he rejected Peirce's definition of the sign, and that is all signs motivating other signs and other signs and other signs. Morris had issue with this. So this was what he decided to stick his hands into and stick his paws into in the famous words of a friend of mine, stick his grubby paws into this, and to somehow resolve this issue. Morris also told us that the Peircean approach is an example of idealistic metaphysics. And this was the springboard for the Morris approach of redefining the sign. So then Morris's issue was that the signs continuously translated, and this infinite semiosis that goes on and on and on and on. This signs continuously translated or interpreted in subsequent signs or in the subsequent sign cannot be used as a defining criterion. This was not enough to define the sign, said Morris. There must be more in nomenclature, must be more structurally, must be more semantically, and so forth. So this is not enough to define the sign, as this involves a sort of circularity, said Morris, where the sign is defined as generating a sign which generates a sign which generates a sign, and this is insufficient for the definition of the sign. And definitely from an epistemological perspective, it's insufficient for defining the sign. So Morris then actually, and this is the paradox, that despite that he was looking to get clearer definitions of the sign, and he complained and stomped his feet. He said, this is not enough to define the sign, jumped up and down and everything. He was not interested in defining the sign anyway. His aim was not, the intention was not to define the sign, but to establish situations in which something can be recognized as a sign. So not to define the sign, but to establish situations in which something can be recognized as a sign. So he then proceeded to map out tables and landscapes of and sign environments in which we would recognize what a sign is. So we will get to the modes and everything and the classifications very soon, and we'll see how he did this. And he had divisions, certain divisions, within which he landscaped the idea of the sign and provided articulations of different types of signs and discourses and everything, and in that way we developed clearer pictures of the versatility of the sign and how it works in language and everything. Okay, so I'm going to again quote Morris from his work of 1946. Morris tells us that signs, at least at the human level, do frequently generate a series of sign processes, but I see no reason why this fact about signs should be incorporated into the definition of sign itself. So one of the classifications or divisions that Morris then proceeded to work on was, of course, pragmatics. And this was building on from Mead and Peirce and their work on pragmatism. And in the pragmatic movement in American philosophy, which was republished in 1970, Morris did this quite well and quite effectively. And the work was, I guess we can break it up into two parts. And the first part was a survey of ideas informing pragmatism in the United States, and it was very Americocentric. So he conducted a survey of ideas that were quite influential in pragmatism in the United States, and he attributes a lot of the work to four philosophers, Peirce, James, Dewey, and Mead. And in the second part of the text, he provides an overview, a contextualization, and an interpretive key of his life's work. So what is pragmaticism then? Pragmatism is concerned about the relation between deliberate behavior, a deliberate behavior or behavior of deliberation, and the intellectual purpose or purport of symbols. And this was agreed to by Morris as well. Not only Peirce, but this was a Peircean idea, but Morris also took hold of that, and he very much agreed to that, and he used this as his springboard to progress. And the idea of pragmatism then became a behavioral semiotic foundation for further work. And the ideas, I guess the ideas of Peirce, and which were subsequently adopted by Morris, and the ideas on behavioral semiotics then became foundational for the field of pragmatism for Peirce and so forth, as did pragmatism deal with the problems of philosophy at the time. And recall that Peirce and Morris were, as much as they were semioticians or linguists, they were also philosophers, if not more. Peirce certainly was a philosopher, certainly, as we discussed, and Morris was definitely a philosopher. So what does pragmatics do then? The pragmatics or pragmatism or pragmatism movement is an inquiry or constitutes an inquiry into the nature of meaning. And this connects meaning and action. So the whole idea of pragmatics was to take the sign and see how it connects to action. It's not just about a status or a stasis, it's about a process. And we will see, if we have not already begun to, that there is nothing in life that is not process. And if we take a look at the Greek pronoun for I myself, the letter I am standing here. In English, of course, I is a noun. It's a pronoun. It is about a static symbol or static figure. But in Greek, the pronoun is not a noun, it's actually a verb. So Morris told us that if there is meaning in signs, then a certain meaning action or meaning behavior connection would imply that semiotics should be developed as an actional or behavioral theory and not a static theory about static things. So if there is a meaning action connection, then semiotics should be about a process and connected to behavioral theory. So in that sense, the subsequent and very huge field of pragmatics or pragmatism reevaluates action in the cognitive process. And this was a very big thing for work done in psychology, sociology, biology even, and of course there was a frequent recourse to work of Darwin and a revision or reassessment of how Darwinian thought also fit into the idea of the sign and everything. So in pragmatics then, the mind is not a substance, as in Cartesian dualism. It's not a process, as in idealism. And it's not a set of relations, as in classical empiricism. Okay? But the function or activity of the mind is exercised by both verbal and non-verbal signs. And that's what pragmatics tells us, and that is the basis and the grounding of pragmatics. So in his 6 Theories of Mind of 1932, Morris tells us that the theory of signs and verbal language is very necessary for understanding the mind. So what does Morris do then? He moves on to try to describe meaning through practical verifiability, through methods of practical verifiability, where he attempts to continuously, or at least set up situations where we can legitimate the sign in a practical way. And he grounds this in a sort of truth of assertion.